I am Nancy Maron. I'm the program manager for this strand of research at Ithaka S+R that focuses on the sustainability of digital resources. Ithaka S+R is a strategy and research group, which means that we do consulting and we also do original research. The folks that we work with most are libraries, publishers, scholarly societies, academics, anyone in the realm of scholarly communications. They've seen their world change due to digital technology, and we try to help them figure it out, and we try to research the questions that we think will help them to figure it out. Universities have so much digital content right now. Many are trying their own efforts to put all of the fruits of the intellectual labors of their faculty online in various ways, whether it's course materials, whether it's content that the scholars have created through the grants that they've received, all sorts of digital resources. And yet the challenge really starts once the content has been created. So if a professor or a research team receives a grant and creates something beautiful and wonderful and useful, once the grant has ended, they will still have to think about who is going to continue to operate it after that stage. So who's going to continue to develop the functionality? Will they want to enhance the content? Will they want to attract more people to use it? These activities go on after the work has first been done. Sustainability, specifically for digital resources, has become a major issue. In the last decade or so, there's been so much creation of digital content in particular, which has been fantastic to see. But it becomes hard and fairly complicated to maintain it. And by maintain, we don't just mean preserve, but we mean keep it valuable and interesting and dynamic and to keep people engaged in it. And so that whole suite of activities is much more complicated, and the fun only starts once the content has been created. Jisc and Ithaka S+R started to talk about a challenge that we noticed in the system. And we noticed a problem that was that a lot of grant-funded projects, the leaders of those projects, would create something wonderful and then return to the funder. And it was not just Jisc, it was many funders were experiencing this, seeking additional funding to support the ongoing operations of the projects that they'd begun. In principle, this sounds like it might be a good idea, but often funders are looking to invest in new things, not support core operating costs. So the challenge was, how can these grantees, how can their projects continue to live on in a more self-sustaining way past that original grant? So we did an exploration of what those different revenue-generating models were, and we created a very useful report that goes through what those are and who they're useful for and what some challenges may be. But the really interesting part of that paper is that as we did this research and we spoke to more and more people, we found that one of the biggest differences between the models that were being used in the commercial world and what we were seeing on the scholarly side in particular were mindsets. It wasn't this model or that model. It was a sense of understanding that there's a very, very competitive market out there, even for nonprofit digital content. It's a market for audience. How can we go out there, find our audience, understand what's competing for attention with this audience, and then create things that they are going to love to use and be excited to use. So there's a piece of that paper that ends up talking about what these fundamental mindsets are that are going to be useful for people who find themselves managing ongoing digital resources. As we sat around with folks workshopping this paper and thinking about it afterwards, there were so many exceptions. People felt that they were interesting models in theory, but to really understand if they could work or if they were working, we really needed to look at how they were actually being applied in practice. So we decided on a methodology that would involve case studies, going to identify projects that were experimenting with this and finding out in detail why they'd chosen to try it, how they were doing with it, and what steps they'd taken to get there. The very first thing we went looking for were exciting and interesting and effective revenue models. And that was actually what drove the original selection. We also wanted diversity of locations. We have some that are in the US, some in the UK, one in France, one in Germany, and one in Egypt. And we also wanted different kinds of projects. So you see some that are born digital, some that are digitization projects. We wanted a diversity of institutional homes. So some are in research libraries and some are in cultural heritage organizations and Some are in other sorts of places. So we have a nice wide range of types of projects that allowed us to really look quite deeply at how a very similar question, how do we support our digital resources, was being played out. There were 5 different things that we saw. We would think of these as sets of activities that we saw these projects doing that, if they were doing them extremely well, was helping to lead to the success of their project. The first thing had to do with having a dynamic and engaged leadership. Someone at the top of the project who was going to be in charge of not just setting course, but actively going out and advocating on behalf of the project, creating relationships that were going to be extremely valuable for identifying funding sources later on, and setting a tone of experimentation that permeates the entire group that's working on the project. One of the greatest challenges for any of these digital projects is what we think of as identifying a value proposition. Everyone who engages in creating digital content does it because they think it's valuable and important. So that part's not the challenge. The challenge is identifying who else, besides the team creating it, is going to find the most value in it. This becomes tremendously important when it's a question of proving impact and identifying revenue sources. So the projects that were doing a great job in really pinpointing why an audience would want to engage with this content and how they would engage with it found great success in developing their models because they built them in order to do those things. Once a digital project has been created, it certainly has some ongoing costs of some sort. That's obvious. In terms of how a project team determines how they can manage those costs, in other words, keep those costs as low as possible, a lot of the projects we saw were doing this in very, very creative ways. One of the creative ways was in seeking partnerships. What tasks can be done by someone outside more efficiently than we can do it ourselves. We saw several examples of that. And the other example that we see quite often are projects that are housed at institutions where the institution has such a wealth of resources that the project team itself is able to benefit from that. That could be staff time, it could be a donation of in-kind services from a legal team, it could be any of a number of things like that. Of course, when that becomes an important part of the whole sustainability plan for a project, then that also becomes an ongoing negotiation to make sure that those contributions and those partnerships are kept healthy, that the terms are understood equally on both sides, and that those contributions continue to come in so the project can rely on them. Once a project has figured out what it wants to do, how much it's going to cost to do it, and how much of that cost is going to be taken care of by somebody else, meaning the institution may be helping or a partner may be helping, there's always some amount of cost that remains. And the question then becomes, where can they go to generate that extra slice of funding that they're going to need to do the work they want to do? So we saw a lot of projects experimenting with revenue generation and sources of earned revenue. Some consider this a major part of their plan. Some have a subscription model that essentially covers most of what they need to do. Others are more experimental. They might be testing the waters with a sponsorship here, a little advertising there, individual donation model over here. So there's all kinds of different things that the projects were trying. The key to experimenting with revenue generation is experimenting and trying the things that fit, and making sure that the model that you try is not actually going to cost more to implement than it's going to bring back to you. A really important element of developing a sustainability plan, and actually in managing any of these projects for the long term, has to do with establishing goals and metrics for success. So when a project is being created, that might be obvious. Success might mean we've digitized what we said we were going to digitize. But it's those ongoing metrics that really stay in place in terms of what the audience needs to be, what a revenue level needs to be, what different levels of engagement look like, and measuring that, seeing how things are going, and if it's difficult to meet targets, reconsidering and reevaluating and considering a new plan. So the projects we saw that were doing really well were very tough with themselves in creating those metrics, measuring them, and then shifting course when needed. We published the original set of 12 case studies in 2009, and we left some hanging questions at the end of each case study. We pointed out things that we thought were going very well for a certain project, and we also pointed out things that we felt might be challenges. Then a year went by, and the global economy suffered a lot of setbacks, and we thought, wow, this might be a chance to see how strong these models were. So we went back 2 years later, and probably most of them, maybe with very few exceptions, had suffered some financial setbacks as a result of the economy. That said, they were all taking very interesting steps to remedy this, and this was what the really interesting thing for us to see was. In some cases where a particular revenue target wasn't being met that they thought they could do through a particular means, they shifted gears and tried something else. And sometimes this something else was working quite well. One of the themes that ran throughout many of the cases we studied was when things got tough, if they were lucky, they had a very reliable host institution sitting behind them. And this was a really critical factor for many of these projects. A lot of the projects that were still doing quite well were the ones that had developed a very strong audience, a strong loyalty among the people who were their users. And in some cases, this was reflected, it's the easiest to see in some cases, in a subscription model. The entities we saw that had created subscription models that were long-standing saw very little fall-off, and in fact, sometimes little increases. And that was fascinating to us because we imagined we might see a much more dramatic story there. On the other hand, a project just beginning to try to create a subscription model and to build that up from the ground up was having some challenges because, and again, it's a difficult economy and those are hard choices, particularly for libraries to make right now. But once that audience has been established and the value of that resource was established with their audience, it was extremely solid, and this formed the basis of a very strong model for them. We developed something called the Framework for Post-Grant Sustainability Planning, which is a very grand way of saying, what are you going to do once the grant ends? It involves several steps. The first one, most obviously, being define what it is, what your goal would be for the impact of this resource post-grant, because that really will drive everything else. If the goal of creating something was simply to have created it, maybe there isn't much that you need to do after, but that's the case for very few of the projects that we study. Instead, it's a question of defining what the set of goals are that you need, the activities around a whole suite of different topics. So there might be sustainability goals around content. You might decide that not just does the content have to persist and stay available, but it has to grow and be developed and enhanced. You might decide that technology is going to be very important because the software it's built with is going to have to improve its functionality and there are going to have to be new things built all the time there. You might think about the ongoing enterprise. If this is considered to be a resource that continues on for a long time, it's going to need leadership. It might need new expertise brought in as it continues to grow. So there are going to be a set of activities over there as well. Once those activities have been defined, you can figure out what it's going to cost to implement them, and then you can think about how you're going to go obtaining the funding and the resource to pay for that. So the framework is really just a way to break down the sustainability question into all of its component parts and to think it through step by step. Funders play a tremendous role in encouraging the sustainability of the digital resources they fund. They obviously have an interest. They don't make the investment because they want to see something disappear, right? Most often, the goal for funding this sort of digital resource, something that includes a tremendous amount of content and a lot of startup time, these are not the experiments that are meant to just, let's see what happens. When a funder is making an investment in digital resource, the question of sustainability comes up frequently, but what we found when we studied this is that the definition is really still a bit up for grabs. When some people talk about it, to them, sustainability means making something openly available. For others, it's a question of preserving digital preservation, so the stability of the digital object. And for others, it means something else. with our report, what we tried to do was to map out all those definitions in a framework so we could understand what the real questions at play were. Any project that is conceiving of creating something that they want to last for a long time needs to be thinking about who this audience is likely to be and who's going to get the most out of this from the earliest stages. And that, in a lot of ways, will drive everything else. Which is not to say that their first concept of who an audience is will not change. These things will change and develop, and you'll discover new things about that over time. But the audience and the people who'd find value from it, whether they are users or funders or something else, is going to be the support network for that resource. It's going to be the people who prove that it had impact and did the thing you wanted it to do, and it may be the people who end up writing a check and helping to pay the bills as well.